James Sunderland is far from the best person to ever take up the mantle of video game protagonist, but he might just be the best written character in the entire medium. Billed as an everyman, James's lack of combat experience grounds the player in the realities of survival horror from a gameplay perspective, while his backstory touches on subjects all of us can relate to, like illness, love, death, guilt, and regret, which draws the player into Silent Hill 2's complex and deeply human narrative. And when the player learns the full scope of James's role in this tragic story, it does so honestly and unflinchingly, allowing us to draw our own conclusions about his motivations by combining in-game evidence with our own lived experience. It's for this reason that the debate around James's actions persists today, over 20 years after the release of the original game. And it's because of this debate that we can confidently describe Silent Hill 2 as one of the best written video games of all time, and James as one of the most important protagonists in the history of the medium. To properly analyze James's character and his role in Silent Hill 2, we need to take a slightly different approach, structurally, than I have throughout this series. Typically, I start my breakdowns with the moment we're introduced to a character, examine every scene that includes them in order, and jump forwards and backwards only when necessary. We're going to get to that step-by-step analysis, beginning with the infamous opening of the bathroom mirror, in a few minutes. But first, we need to acknowledge some of the intricacies about James's character that make him such an icon in the world of video games. Unlike other great video game protagonists, like Kratos from God of War or Joel from The Last of Us, who can certainly be viewed differently depending on your point of view, but ultimately build toward a more concrete narrative intention, James's character was designed with a significant amount of purposeful ambiguity. No two people are going to play Silent Hill 2 and come away with the same take on the type of person he is, nor are they likely to agree on why he committed his greatest sin. These varying interpretations are produced by three key factors. First, the charged and deeply human topics at the heart of the narrative. Second, the way other characters highlight the multifaceted aspects of James' personality. And third, the game's multiple endings, how they transform our understanding of James' actions. Starting with the charged and deeply human topics at the heart of the narrative, Silent Hill 2's major themes include end-of-life care, terminal illness, and the vows that tie together the institution that serves as the end goal for most romantic relationships, marriage. By the time the average person fires up Silent Hill 2 for the first time, they've likely engaged with all these topics on a personal level. If you're in your 20s, then you've probably seen a grandparent enter the final stages of their life, watched a loved one suffer from cancer, and been in a relationship that you thought had the potential to go the distance. With how personal these matters are, they're no doubt going to impact how you view Silent Hill 2's story, and by extension, James's character, who serves as the linchpin that pulls all of these themes together. In the field of education, we call this analysis tool a person's funds of knowledge, when someone brings their individual experiences and prior engagement with a topic to a work or a subject. It's natural to do this, and it no doubt colors how you're going to interpret James. A person who watched their grandfather deteriorate from a disease and felt relief when his suffering was over, for example, is likely going to feel differently about what James did than a person who watched their parents' marriage fall apart because their father cheated on their mother when she was going through chemotherapy. These, of course, are not random examples. These are the real funds of knowledge of two friends of mine who have very different opinions about James because of personal experiences that tie into the themes of the game. By wading into subjects so fundamentally and unfortunately relatable to anyone who's lived long enough to see these tragic realities, we're being invited to bring those experiences into our analysis of James. This is furthered by my second point, the way other characters highlight the differing aspects of James's character. I didn't save his video for last simply because he's the protagonist of the game. I saved him for last because each of the other characters draws attention to varying elements of his personality. Angela, for example, shows us that although Mary was right to say that James can be a kind person at times, there's a clear limit to the empathy he's capable of showing, often does a poor job of reading the room, and can be quick to anger at inconvenient times. Maria, meanwhile, illustrates how much he misses Mary, how critical she was to his life, while also demonstrating his hero complex, and the sexual frustration he's been dealing with since Mary fell ill. You see the different sides of James in every scene, depending on the character he's paired with, and all of us are bound to place different values on these facets of his personality depending on what stands out the most to us and how we connect with those characters. Someone who was bullied when they were younger and identifies with Eddie, for instance, will no doubt feel differently than a teacher or a nurse, who considers James's interactions with Laura to be the strongest reflection of who he is. And finally, moving on to the multiple endings, one of the many brilliant things about Silent Hill 2's story is that no matter what path you take, no matter what decisions you make when you're controlling James, his crime doesn't change. In every version of events, he killed Mary. But depending on the ending you get, his motivations for doing so do change. In some of the endings, you can make the argument that it was a mercy killing, and that James's guilt is a result of his fear that he did it for selfish reasons. In other endings, it's portrayed as a straight-up murder committed for those selfish reasons, so he could move on with his life and find a new partner. In some, it's a combination of these two factors, with evidence pointing in both directions. Examined on the whole, what you get is something of a scale that ranges between selfishness and mercy, where there's always some level of selfishness, but the amount of mercy varies from largely absent to rather significant. Thus, what the game's endings and this scale suggests is that there are at least 6 core ways to interpret James's motivations for killing Mary, each of which produces a dramatically different analysis of James as a character in the mind of the player. And when you blend that with the charged themes and the way that other characters highlight elements of his personality, what we have in James, I'd argue, is a protagonist as complex as the greatest characters in fiction, who can be examined in good faith in a large number of ways. To that end, my plan for this video, as we go scene by scene, is to highlight all of the different but valid ways I see for interpreting James's character. That way, when we reach the end of this video, you can make an informed decision about which conclusion you think makes the most sense for him and the story. I will provide my own belief on this matter, of course, one I've hinted at in my other videos, but my primary goal for this epic of an essay is to make sure that all possible good faith interpretations are honored, and that you walk away from here with a solidified viewpoint on your preferred ending to Silent Hill 2. In doing so, my hope is that this video will stand the test of time as the most complete and honest analysis of James Sunderland ever posted on YouTube. And with that, my friends, let's begin our journey through the fog and through his character with the game's opening scene. When Silent Hill 2 begins, James is standing in front of a mirror in a rest stop bathroom, looking down at his hands. Though the game will try and set him up as a sympathetic figure in a few minutes, anyone familiar with common literary symbolism will know that this is a sign that James is guilty. From Lady Macbeth's desperate attempts to wash her hands clean after the murder of King Duncan, to professional wrestlers in the midst of a heel turn, looking down at one's hands is a sure sign that a character just did something terrible, and is trying to make sense of the way their world has changed in the aftermath of their dark deed. Who are they now, after they soiled their hands in such a horrible way? Does what they've done define them? Where do they go from here? No doubt all of those questions are running through James's mind in this scene, because although the player doesn't know it yet, not long before this moment in the bathroom, James used those hands to suffocate his wife Mary, who's suffering from a terminal illness. She'd just come back from the hospital for a brief trip home, a trip her doctors believed would be her last before the illness finally claimed her. We'll dive into the specifics of all this later in the video, but this grim truth is Silent Hill 2's central conceit, its core plot twist, that the man who came to the resort town he once vacationed in during the peak of his marriage at the behest of a letter he received from his supposedly dead wife isn't just some lonely widower, but the very person who killed the wife he claims to miss so dearly. Significant time will pass before the player learns this, but the clues were always here waiting for us, right at the beginning of his Silent Hill journey. One thing I'd like to note before moving on from James's hands is the way they shake when he looks down at them. It could be an indication of fear of what's coming his way, or perhaps the adrenaline wearing off after the murder. Depending on how you view James's motivations, I think you can make a strong argument for either one. As mentioned, the James killed her is Silent Hill 2's central plot twist, but what happens here in the bathroom is what allows us to get there at all. From this point forward, James, quote, forgets what he did, and instead operates on the belief that Mary died from her disease 3 years ago. How this happens is open to interpretation. From a psychological point of view, you could make the case that he's experiencing a form of dissociative amnesia, where a person forgets key moments and events and then concocts barriers around those memories to keep them from recalling what really happened. In this case, what James forgot, of course, is Mary's murder, and the barrier is his belief that she died of her terminal illness. But it's also possible that it was the magic of Silent Hill that buried the truth, so it could send James on an arduous journey that would force him to confront his sins, accept the reality of what he did, and either move forward, as he does in Leave and Stillness, repeats the process, as seen in Maria, succumbs to guilt, like in Water, or embraces nostalgia, as shown in Bliss. I've brought this up in other videos, but in the Silent Hill games that focus more on the psychological aspects of the survival horror franchise, such as Silent Hill 2 and Downpour, as opposed to the cult-focused games such as Silent Hill 1, 3, and Origins, characters are drawn to Silent Hill because of their traumatic pasts, because of the terrible things they've done to others, or the terrible things that have happened to them. For those characters, the common interpretation is that the town deliberately obscures much of their past, temporarily removing it from their minds so they can force them to process the truth in the most dramatic way possible. Angela is a strong mirror for this point of view. At the beginning of the game, she says she's looking for her mother, and thinks her father and brother are in town as well, while saying nothing of the abuse she suffered at their hands. But as the game goes on, She recalls, progressively, what happened to her, to the point that she's forced to contend with a monstrous representation of her father, and even acknowledge that her mother made excuses for what he did. And all of these realizations, of course, are orchestrated by her odyssey through the town, suggesting that it's Silent Hill and its nature that causes her to experience this gradual recollection. Though I think both explanations are suitable, the second has always made the most sense to me. The game is called Silent Hill after all, and it wasn't until James arrived at the town that all of this started. But let me know what you think about James's amnesia down in the comments. Either way, this is why James doesn't remember what he did and instead believes that Mary died from a disease 3 years ago. He's either living in a fabricated reality created by his mind or one crafted by the magic of Silent Hill. Just as fog obscures the town, so too does fog obscure James's mind. What James tells us next takes things from amnesia to something that borders on delusion. As he walks out to Lake Overlook, James claims that he received a letter from Mary that urged him to come here. He acknowledges that she's dead and states here, for the first time, that she died 3 years ago, and explains that in the letter she says that she's waiting for him in their special place. But the entire town of Silent Hill was their special place, which complicates things, as he's unsure of where to go. Thus, he decides to focus on finding a few of the places where they spent a significant amount of time: Rosewater Park and Lakeview Hotel. But as the player will eventually discover, the letter is fake. As the game progresses, the text will gradually vanish, until it's nothing but a blank piece of paper. This ties back to our previous discussion about whether James's amnesia is a trauma response or something induced by the magic of Silent Hill itself. If James is experiencing dissociative amnesia, then he essentially deluded this letter and its context into existence. If Silent Hill is behind it, then the letter is a manifestation of the town, one that stops working as James gets closer and closer to the truth. For me, the letter is a huge part of why I remain partial to the latter. It just makes more sense to me, but I certainly won't dismiss the former. It's entirely possible that James imagined this letter into being. Either way, on the surface, the letter serves two purposes. First, it ends up becoming a sort of MacGuffin. When you combine the fact that this letter gave James his initial sense of direction with its gradual vanishing, it establishes an underlying mission to find Mary's real letter, which James only gets to read in the Leave ending. It's present in Stillness, in Water, and the Maria endings as well, but we're never given any evidence that he actually read it in those conclusions. To me, that's part of what makes the Leave ending the game's, quote, good ending. Although, as we'll discuss later in the video, there is still little hope for a positive outcome in the wider life of James Sunderland, even in that version of events. But regardless, that real letter, though it's certainly not the Death Star plans or anything of that nature, becomes the game's central item as a result of this fictitious one. The letter also sets up James as a sympathetic figure. Despite what we saw with his hands in the bathroom, this scene, with its powerful, emotional music accompanied by the letter's lovingly narrated text, sets up James to look like a simple everyman who just wants to be reunited with his wife. It causes the player to feel for him and motivates them to help him find her. We all desire true love, on some level, and seeing a sad widower who had his love ripped away from him by illness is an easy way to make the player believe James to be an honest and authentic character. Though it's not long before the player certainly starts to realize that something isn't right, and as we covered earlier, the clues were already there. This is the game's signature trick, and a devilishly clever one at that. Because the man we're conditioned to sympathize with is, in truth, running from the darkest of sins. James then leaves the Lake Overlook and makes his way into Silent Hill proper. The mood shift at this point in the game is rather immediate. There's an uneasiness to the environment. The town's trademark fog begins to set in. Eventually, James ends up in a graveyard, where he encounters Angela Orozco for the first time. Another tormented soul drawn to the town of Silent Hill, Angela's story helps shed light on James's own, as she's always a few steps ahead of him in her Silent Hill journey, and thus helps to foreshadow everything that's coming his way. Here, in their initial meeting, Angela seems to already be aware of the fact that the town is dangerous, and that there's something wrong with it. At this early stage, Angela's warning doesn't faze James. He still has precious little idea of what he's in for. But all of that is going to change very, very soon. Not long after James enters Silent Hill itself, he picks up the tools of his new survival horror trade: a radio to detect nearby enemies and a simple 2x4, and encounters his first monster, a lying figure. Every monster in the game, save for one notable exception, is meant to be a reflection of James's subconscious or horrific representation of James's sins manifested by the town, depending on your point of view. Either way, no matter how you slice it, everything about these monsters, from their visual design to the symbology behind them, ties back to James. And thus, in working our way through how the game characterizes him, we'll be examining each of the monsters as well. They're grim mirrors of James, illustrations of feelings he had, thoughts he struggled with, and things he did, or perhaps wanted to do. In the case of the lying figure, its straitjacket-like torso could be interpreted as a symbol of the way James felt confined during Mary's illness, but according to Masahiro Ito himself, Silent Hill 2's art director and monster designer, the lying figure's upper body is meant to represent a body bag. In the shot here, you can pretty clearly see a zipper, much like a body bag would have. Thus, you could almost look at this monster as a reflection of what should have been done with Mary's body after her death, as opposed to what James ended up doing, wrapping her up in her bedsheet, tossing her into the back of his car, and driving off to Silent Hill. As for the creature's name, Ito says it has a double meaning. It's a reference to Mary, lying in her hospital bed, and Mary's dead body, lying in the back seat of James's car. So while I always encourage folks to interpret things the way they see fit, I'm big on the whole death of the author theory myself. According to Ito, who knows more about Silent Hill 2 than practically anyone else around, the lying figure is, chiefly, a symbol of Mary when she was sick in bed, and Mary's corpse. When you combine this with the way the lying figures are capable of spitting acid or poison at James, this makes even more sense. The same way Mary was sick, so too are the lying figures. Now that we've covered Silent Hill 2's first monster, it's a great time to shift gears a bit and talk about gameplay. As I'm sure you've noticed, I spend more time discussing the narratives of the games I cover than the actual gameplay. But that's because we're usually talking about supporting characters. We're now examining protagonist, the very avatar of gameplay, so it's important to dive into that aspect of things here. Silent Hill 2's combat is intentionally janky. Swinging weapons with James feels awkward and unnatural, and when you shoot guns, you're going to miss a frustrating number of shots. All of this is by design, because it helps the player to immerse themselves in James's character. He's an everyman. He might wear a military jacket, but he has no real combat experience. Before the events of Silent Hill 2, he worked in an office. If you try to fight every monster you encounter, like James is some kind of action hero, then you're not playing the game as intended. With its clunky combat, the developers want you to feel like James, an average person who's thrust into a terrible situation. It helps the player to relate to him. Unless you've got combat experience yourself, you'd probably be as much of an overmatched and janky fighter as he is. After defeating the first of many lying figures, James begins to traverse the streets of Silent Hill. His journey will eventually lead him to a pair of adjoined apartments, Woodside Apartments and Blue Creek Apartments. It's fitting that the game's first true level, if you like to call it that, takes place in a set of apartment buildings. Much of Silent Hill 2's narrative centers around grounded domestic issues, such as marriage, relationships, and sexuality, so it's appropriate that a significant portion of the early gameplay loop takes place in a dilapidated living space. It's a theme that will continue across the game, as each location is tailor-made to explore James's personal history. We start here with the domestic, and will eventually move on to themes of illness at the hospital and guilt at the prison. These well-chosen settings are one of Silent Hill 2's strengths. Later games will try to do the same thing, but often recycled the same locations that worked for the first three games without the context that made them meaningful to begin with. In Woodside Apartments, James finds his next tool, the flashlight. As basic an item as it might seem for a survival horror title, Silent Hill has always applied its usage in an intriguing manner. It allows James to get a clearer view of his surroundings, and of course to see the monsters, but it also helps them to see him. The stealth or pacifist run of Silent Hill doesn't sound like a fun way to play the game to me, but if one were to attempt it, turning off the flashlight would be the first thing you need to do. From a narrative perspective, it's important to note where James finds the flashlight, on a mannequin that's wearing clothing that looks just like Mary's. You could make the argument that this is meant to symbolize that Mary is James's guiding light. I'd say this interpretation works on several levels. Right now, at the point in the game where James seems to be nothing more than a lonely widower, it's as simple as the idea that he wants to find Mary and discover the truth about the letter, and the flashlight is a tool that can help him get there. But by the time we get to the end of the game, and the truth about what James did is exposed, finding Mary, his guiding light, remains the only way for him to get the game's, quote, best ending, and leave Silent Hill. But just like when he acquired the radio and the 2x4, after James picks up the flashlight, he's attacked by a new type of monster, the appropriately named Mannequin. Compared to the lying figures, the meaning behind the Mannequins is fairly easy to deduce. Two pairs of female legs stuck on top of each other, they symbolize the sexual frustration James felt while Mary was sick and staying in the hospital. Now, let's stop here for a moment to dig into the topic of sexual frustration a bit, because it's going to come up frequently throughout this video, because how you view a sexual frustration is going to play a significant role in your ultimate interpretation of James. As I discussed at the beginning of the video, the enduring question of Silent Hill 2 is whether James is a decent person who did a terrible thing in the name of mercy, if he's a selfish, cold-blooded killer, or if the truth lies somewhere in between. You could apply that same type of logic to his sexual frustration. Humans are sexual beings, and thus, on the surface, it's both realistic and expected for a husband who's been away from his wife for a long time to have feelings of sexual frustration. To say that sexual needs aren't complicated by the terminal illness of a partner would be to dismiss a crucial part of the human condition, in my view. So you could look at the Mannequins as a demonstration that James is just horny, and leave it at that. But when you consider the preponderance of sexual imagery, from the Mannequins to Maria to the Flesh Lips and Heaven's Night, it leaves one to wonder if James's sexual frustrations are more than just simple human nature, but rather an indication that his lack of intimacy was frequently on his mind during Mary's illness, and that he was often thinking about how much he wanted to get laid when he should have been thinking about how to support his terminally ill wife. Of course, none of this makes James look good, and is the sort of interpretation that lends itself to the Maria and Rebirth endings. As far as the Mannequin is concerned, I think you can find some supporting evidence for this interpretation in the design and language surrounding the creature itself. It's literally two female lower bodies pasted on top of each other with no face. There's a focus on the genitalia and nothing else, and therefore you could very easily argue that the Mannequin demonstrates that James just wanted someone to have sex with. He cared about his physical needs, not the emotional needs of his wife, who was slowly, painfully dying in the hospital. Even the name gestures towards this. A mannequin resembles a person, but it isn't a person. It can't talk or voice its own opinions. All it does is serve a function. And when you couple the name with the fact that James, right before he encounters one of these monsters for the first time, found a mannequin adorned with Mary's clothing, it's not too much of a stretch to say that James viewed Mary as a mannequin, as someone who served a function in his life, not a full-fledged person. And again, we do see James express this outlook in the Rebirth and Maria endings, so I do think that reading of the monster is there. Now, those are the two most common interpretations you'll hear about the way the game portrays James's sexual frustration. That's just an expression of human nature, something that naturally arose due to his wife's absence, or it's evidence of his chauvinism and selfishness. But I do believe there's a third way to interpret it, one that I'm going to come back to throughout the video. I've mentioned this a few times now, but I feel pretty strongly that the remake's James Sunderland, portrayed by Luke Roberts, is slightly softer than the original's James Sunderland, portrayed by Guy Seehey. And with the remake's James Sunderland, I think you can not only see his overwhelming guilt, which was always there even in the original, but also his anxiety, which I don't recall seeing as much in the 2000s version. And when you mix guilt and anxiety, what you often get is shame. A belief that you didn't just do something bad or think about something bad, but that you, yourself, are a bad person. Therefore, following this line of thinking, it's possible that the game's sexual imagery is meant to indicate that although James was indeed sexually frustrated while Mary was sick, he felt terrible about it, to the point where he thought these natural human urges made him a terrible person. And when you consider that these sexualized creatures, from the mannequins to the flesh lips, literally attack James, it's as if he's punishing himself for his sexual frustration, which is exactly what feelings of shame do to a person. As for which one of these schools of thought I personally subscribe to, you'll have to wait for my take on that one until the end of the video. But for now, I will say that it's undeniable that the developers wanted this topic, like so many others in the game, to remain ambiguous. So, in the purpose of staying consistent, these are the three potential interpretations for you to consider when it comes to James and his sexuality, and I'll keep referring back to them each time this topic resurfaces. Moving on from the mannequins, as he navigates the apartment buildings, James encounters two more human characters. The first is Laura, who kicks the fire escape key away from James, steps on his hand, and then runs away, kicking off an antagonistic rapport that will continue to develop as the game goes on. As I discussed in my video on her from back in March, Laura's role is multifaceted. Throughout the game, she both torments and tests James, trying to discern if he's the man she fears him to be, or if he's the man her dear friend Mary believed him to be. She's trying to make him prove that he loved Mary, that he was worthy of her affection, and in pursuit of that goal, Laura is going to do everything she can to piss James off, starting with this moment right here. The second is Eddie, who James finds throwing up in a bathroom, just a short distance from a dead body in a refrigerator. What stands out to me about this first meeting between the two of them, from James's perspective, is how much more composed James is here than Eddie. Back in the last conversation he had with another human, when he spoke to Angela in the graveyard, James seemed to be roughly on equal footing with Angela, though she was, as mentioned, further ahead in her Silent Hill journey than he was, and thus knew more about the town, its fog, and its monsters than he did. I'd argue that purely in terms of their composure and demeanor, they both seem to be in control of themselves. Mostly, anyway. It's clear that they've both been through a lot, but they're not falling apart. Not yet. Eddie, on the other hand, comes off as pathetic right from the beginning. Demeanor aside, this interaction is critical, and then it marks the first time that James speaks to another character who can see the monsters. Laura can't. It's why she kicked the key out of James's reach and ran away without a care in the world. But Eddie can, and so although the game makes it very clear that Eddie is worse off than James at this point, it's still establishing him as someone with an inherent similarity to him, another kindred spirit, much like Angela. As the game goes on, it would continue to toy with this concept, and the developers will end up using Eddie to help prepare players for Silent Hill 2's most shocking revelation. But here in the bathroom, this scene is all about introducing Eddie to James and making sure he knows that there are others out there who are like him and are contending with the monsters of Silent Hill. After completing the coin puzzle and using the key to enter room 201, the player will witness one of Silent Hill 2's most disturbing and best known scenes, as we encounter Pyramid Head in earnest for the first time. He can be seen staring at James from behind some steel bars earlier on, but it's not much of a proper introduction, not the way this moment is here. We'll dive deep into Pyramid Head's symbolism in a moment, but first, let's talk about what happens in this scene. While James is looking down at a handkerchief that resembles Mary's trademark clothing, Pyramid Head tosses a mannequin into the room, and then does something to it while James looks on from the closet. I say it that way because the question of what exactly is happening here is a huge subject of discussion in the Silent Hill community, a discussion where the intentions of Masahiro Ito are often ignored. So, in the interest of respecting something that Ito is clearly very passionate about when it comes to Silent Hill 2 discourse, I'm going to discuss his intentions first, explain how to interpret them as far as Pyramid Head's role and James's character is concerned, and then move on to the common take about what happens here, as well as a sort of middle ground that, I think, honors both viewpoints. Although most viewers come away from this scene under the impression that Pyramid Head sexually assaults and then kills this mannequin, Masahiro Ito is adamant that there's nothing sexual about it. According to Ito, Pyramid Head just kills this mannequin, nothing more. He's pretty insistent about this. It's basically his equivalent of the "don't make me tap the sign" meme over on his Twitter page. People have been asking him about it for years, and he's been consistent in saying that his sole intention was to depict Pyramid Head killing this mannequin, not a sexual assault. You can see evidence of this in the way the remake, which Ito was involved with, frames the scene. It's shot in a far more ambiguous nature than the original. Some have accused Bloober Team of censoring what's happening here, but I'm inclined to believe that the real reason they edited it was to honor Ito's point of view while not completely changing it from what fans remember. So, following up on this, the question is, if Pyramid Head is indeed just killing this mannequin, then what's the significance of this scene? Why have James witnessed it from the closet? Well, first, let's talk about Pyramid Head himself, because he's a far more nuanced character than he might appear to be. Honestly, I'd argue that he's perhaps the most nuanced and multifaceted monster in all of video games. Pyramid Head is a manifestation created by Silent Hill, or created by James' subconscious, harkening back to our earlier discussion, to punish him for killing Mary. He's a physical embodiment of guilt, and his appearance is based on a painting of the colonial age executioners of Silent Hill that James saw at the Historical Society during his vacation here with Mary, back before she got sick. Thus, everything about Pyramid Head indicates James' desire to receive judgment, to pay the price for what he did. At the same time, another aspect of Pyramid Head's role is that he's always pushing James towards the truth, to face the reality of what he did. We see this later on when he tosses James down a floor at Brook Haven Hospital so he can finally reunite with Lara, and both times that he kills Maria. He's kind of like a bouncer, trying to wake up the drunk guy in the bar bathroom and make him clean up the mess he made the night before. So although he does represent James' desire for punishment, he's also trying to bring him to a point where he doesn't need to be punished anymore. He's more of a force of nature than an antagonist. He either punishes James or pushes him, depending on the situation. And in an interpretation where all that happens in this scene is that Pyramid Head kills these mannequins, Pyramid Head pushes James towards the truth in two key ways. First, by killing the mannequin as James watches on, he's reminding James that he killed Mary. As Ito explains, it's just an abstraction at this point, but as the game goes on, Pyramid Head will become more blatant about forcing James to accept that he killed Mary, as shown when he removes all subtext from the equation by murdering Maria not just once, but twice. At the same time, by killing the mannequin, Pyramid Head is removing obstacles from James's path. James can't face reality if he gets killed by a mannequin, and thus, Pyramid Head kills this one to help clear the way for James. Evidence of this concept can be found throughout Otherworld apartments, where the player can find a ton of dead mannequins and lying figures, all of them butchered by Pyramid Head. No other monster kills other monsters, so there's no doubt that it was Pyramid Head that did this. So that was Ito's intention in this scene, for Pyramid Head to kill the mannequin to push James towards the truth and clear the path for him. Now, again, that having been said, Ito himself admits that he does understand that Pyramid Head's acting in this scene looks sexual, and does say that it's okay for people to have their own opinions and interpretations. What he doesn't like is the repetition of the idea that the canon explanation for this scene is that it's a representation of sexual assault, or sexual frustration. And as I said earlier, I am a big fan of Death of the Author. It's a well-established school of thought and a dominant field of literary criticism. Take A Clockwork Orange, for example. Author Anthony Burgess is insistent that his work has been misinterpreted, but his take is regularly and routinely ignored. Or consider Rorschach from Watchmen. Alan Moore's intention was to create a fascist, right-wing, smelly Batman who no one should aspire to, and yet there are plenty of people who idolize and even identify with the character. Masahiro Ito's commentary on this scene is just another instance of this kind of dynamic happening again, this time in the medium of video games. All of this is to say that while I really like Ito's interpretation of the scene, I think it makes a lot of sense, and have come around to believing it to be the correct take myself. You don't need to agree with him if you don't want to. So, if it is a sexual assault, as many fans tend to believe, then what's the purpose of it? Well, as we discussed earlier, Pyramid Head is a multifaceted character, and although his two primary roles are to punish and push James, there are also times where he's intended to serve as a stand-in for James. Many theorize that beneath the mask, Pyramid Head might even look like James. Ito has alluded to this in his own commentary in the years since the release of the original game. Taking this a step further, Luke Roberts said in interviews that he did some of the motion capture for Pyramid Head. Specifically, they looped him doing Pyramid Head's walk while carrying around something that he pretended was a large, heavy object. So even from a game direction perspective, behind the scenes work was done to align James and Pyramid Head. And when you pair these 2 points together, the sexual assault or the sexually suggestive death of the mannequins, with the concept of Pyramid Head as a stand-in for James, what you get is that the town of Silent Hill, or James' subconscious, is telling James that this is who he is. Circling back to our earlier discussion about the nature of his sexual frustration, if he really is a chauvinist who put his sexual needs over his wife's emotional needs, then it's suggesting that James might have thought about doing vile things like this. Thus, James is indeed as much of a monster as some folks believe him to be. If that's how you personally come away from this scene, then there's really no question that such an outlook will be your ultimate verdict on James. Now, that having been said, there is a major flaw in this line of thinking. Once again, my goal is not to present one singular interpretation of the characters I cover, but to look at them through multiple lenses on the road to presenting my own. And for that reason, I usually don't dismiss interpretations. But in this case, I do have to say that I think there's a huge leap between sexual frustration and sexual assault. Sexual assault is a crime of power. Sexual frustration is an urge produced by a lack of sex. Therefore, despite the game's frequent use of sexual imagery, I, personally, don't think this point of view makes sense for that reason. Those moments and characters are about showing us that James struggled with the lack of intimacy while Mary was ill, not that he considered committing another crime on top of the one he's already hiding from. But I do believe there's a way of squaring these two interpretations and finding something akin to a middle ground. If we look at the game's sexualized imagery and this scene through the lens of shame and anxiety, the idea that Silent Hill, or James' subconscious, is trying to make him feel like he's a terrible person for being sexually frustrated while his wife was terminally ill, then what Pyramid Head is doing here is that he's trying to punish James by saying that those thoughts and those feelings make him just as vile as someone who would do what he just did to the mannequin. You could even make the argument that this interpretation makes room for both sides of Pyramid Head's role, as he transitions from punishing James to pushing him towards the truth by killing the mannequin after he shames him for his sexual frustration. And for the sake of clarity, in the tweet I referenced earlier, Ito is specifically referring to the closet scene, not the other instances of sexual imagery or sexual frustration, which are indeed all over the game. So those are the 3 different ways, in my view, that you can interpret Closet Gate. If you have an alternative take or your own thoughts on this, feel free to share them down in the comments. Regardless of how you view the scene, once Pyramid Head has killed the mannequin, he approaches the closet, where James takes a few shots at him. Pyramid Head simply shrugs off the bullets, then picks up the mannequin's corpse and walks away. From there, James will cross over into Blue Creek Apartments and experience his first Otherworld transition. In Otherworld, monsters are more plentiful, the layout of the buildings change, and we encounter symbolism that reflects both the history of Silent Hill itself and that of our tortured protagonist. Much as it is across the rest of the series, Silent Hill 2's Otherworld is rusted, worn out, and dilapidated, but what makes James's unique is the amount of water that can be found throughout it. Interpretations on the reasons for this vary, but one common theory is that it's a nod to the in-water ending, which has long been the preferred conclusion for many fans and was even used as the canon conclusion in the game's novelization. I'm not the biggest fan of this take, personally, because I think that one of the key points of Silent Hill 2 is that there isn't a canon ending to the game. You're supposed to choose the conclusion that makes the most sense to you based on how you personally view James and his actions. Thus, the idea that any one feature is meant to symbolize one of the endings doesn't align with all the intentional ambiguity. However, I do believe this interpretation is on the right track, at least somewhat. While I don't think that the waterlogged nature of James's Otherworld is meant to represent the in-water ending, I do think it's a reference to where he ends up in that ending, Toluca Lake. In the videotape James watches at Lakeview Hotel before his greatest sin is revealed, Mary coughs, which seems to indicate that this is the moment that she first got sick, as in, she first contracted her illness in Silent Hill. And if you pull a Vadi video and piece together the game's environmental storytelling, particularly the notes you can find in the Historical Society, you'll learn that Brook Haven Hospital was originally established to care for the victims of an epidemic that was believed to have originated from Toluca Lake. I suspect that this unknown disease Mary is suffering from is this same one from the epidemic, and if it hasn't been seen in literally 200 or 300 years, then it helps explain why doctors were unsure of how to properly treat it. Unless they were familiar with this little-known epidemic that only affected this tiny New England resort town, they wouldn't have known how to proceed. All of this is to say that if Mary's illness stems from the lake, then it makes sense that there's water all over his Otherworld. It was the lake that started all this. Of course it's here too. At the same time, there's also something of an elemental theme across all the characters' Otherworlds presented in the game. Eddie's is full of ice, Angela's is on fire, so James's waterlogged Otherworld is a continuation of this. Speaking of Angela, while traversing Otherworld, James will encounter her for the second time. This meeting is far more harrowing than the last, as he finds her looking into the mirror, playing with her knife, and making a series of depressing statements. The implication here is clear. She's considering taking her own life. For a full breakdown of this crucial scene and what it means for Angela herself, I'd recommend checking out my video on her from back in May. But from James's perspective, I think it's crucial to point out that in this scene, we do see evidence of his slightly softer portrayal in the remake, and the limitations to it as well. He does reach out to her, and tries to empathize with her by telling her more about Mary, but his bedside manner is poor, and he's obviously out of his depth in this type of situation. We'll see all of this again in his next meeting with this incredibly tragic character. Critically, as far as him and his ultimate fate is concerned, it's here that James receives Angela's knife. Though it serves no practical purpose as an item, as in it doesn't open any doors and it can't be used in combat, it does have a function to help trigger the in-water ending, where James makes the same decision Angela is contemplating here. We'll talk more about this when we get to the end of the video, but I really think that the game gives us items that have such an influence over the endings is rather significant when it comes to how we, in turn, are given a great degree of leeway in forging our own personal interpretation of James. But in the immediate aftermath, Angela's knife ends up being used for a far different purpose, as inspiration for Pyramid Head's great knife. Not long after his meeting with Angela, James runs into his chief tormentor again, and this time around, there's no closet for him to hide in. A boss fight ensues, in which James can't really do any damage to Pyramid Head. No matter how many bullets he pumps into him, no matter how many times he bashes him with the plank, or, in New Game Plus, slashes at him with the chainsaw, he shows no sign of slowing down, no indication that any of this is actually hurting him. Circling back to Pyramid Head's narrative role, I'd argue that his invincibility is symbolic of the fact that James can't battle his way through his current predicament. He needs to face the truth. Realization and acceptance, not a fight response, is the only way forward. Once James has dealt enough damage to Pyramid Head, or lasted long enough against his adversary, he'll leave the area, and James's first foray into Otherworld will come to a close. After leaving the Otherworld apartments, James will bump into Lara. They only talk for a few minutes before she runs away again, but their conversation is critical nonetheless. James tried to call her out for kicking the keys away from him and stepping on his foot, but Lara isn't having any of it. Just like back in the apartments with Angela, we see the limit to James's softer side here. Sure, he has a good reason to be pissed off at Lara, but still, she's a kid, and James approaches her without the slightest bit of tact, in a surly manner that makes it rather obvious that he probably hasn't spent much time around children and has no idea how to interact with them. Which, of course, has always made me rather concerned about some of the potential implications of the Leave ending, but that's a discussion for later on. In any case, as far as our understanding of James is concerned, what this conversation helps to do is recenter his focus. Aside from showing Mary's picture to Angela and an oblique reference to her during his meeting with Eddie, we haven't heard much about James's late wife since he entered Silent Hill proper. Now, in Lara, we have a character who claims to have known Mary, and is even reading a letter that looks much like the one James was reading earlier. So directionally, that's part of what this conversation is about, returning James's attention and the player's attention to Mary. At the same time, we begin to get a deeper exploration of James's personality. Our earlier conversations about James and his delusions and frustrations can extend to just about every aspect of his character. With every major step he takes and revelation we uncover about his past, his sins, and his relationship with Mary, we're forced to ask ourselves, did James kill Mary out of mercy, but now struggles with guilt and anxiety over his actions? Is he a chauvinist who murdered her because he wanted her out of the way, so he could move on with his life? or does the truth lie somewhere in between? With Laura's last words, she plays on that ever-burning question, as she accuses James of never really loving Mary at all. It's a dig that hits James incredibly hard. You can see how much the accusation shakes him. The reason for it might seem obvious, but it really does tie back to that question, because based on how you feel about it, he's either struck by it because it's true, or because it's something that he fears might be true. Shortly after his meeting with Laura, James will encounter another incredibly important character, Maria. As I discussed in my video on her, she's a fantasy version of Mary created by the town, or James' subconscious, whose purpose is to distract James from his true goal, finding the real Mary and accepting the truth about what he did to her. It's something I haven't really considered until I started working on this video, but I suppose you could consider her to be the opposite of Pyramid Head. While he wants James to face reality, she doesn't. Because if he embraces her as a replacement for Mary, then James will just start this dark and dangerous cycle all over again, as shown in the Maria ending. Much like the other sexualized monsters and images throughout the game, the same discussion comes up here with Maria. If you believe James to be a selfish chauvinist, then Maria is a demonstration of what he wished Mary would have been like, flirty and outgoing, rather than the modest and sweet woman who fell terminally ill by the time she was 25. But if you look at her through the lens of shame and anxiety, then Maria is the town's way, or James's subconscious's way, of presenting his sexual frustrations in the most over-the-top terms, by taking his wife, pampering her up with makeup and a sexy outfit, and trying to tempt him into giving into the desires he's so embarrassed for having in the first place. Topics of sexuality aside, what stands out to me about this scene on the pier, from James's point of view, is how lopsided the power dynamics are. Maria is fully in control here. Though James is clearly put off by her uncanny resemblance to Mary and seems to know she's trouble, she ultimately has him right where she wants him, and convinces him to follow her to a so-called special place in search of Mary. Before we move on, let's dive a bit deeper into what I just said about how James is put off by Maria. I'd argue that this is another example of how the remake's portrayal of James is slightly softer than the original. Though he isn't always this way around her, it happens enough that it is rather noticeable. For me, it opens up room for more charitable takes on James's motivations that weren't as easy to come up with as they were in the original game. We'll talk about why I think Bluer Team did this towards the end of the video, but I think it's just as important to note as the potential for a shame and anxiety interpretation of his sexual frustration. From there, James is tasked with protecting Maria as they travel through Silent Hill. Sticking close to her, talking with her when opportunities arise, and protecting her from damage will help the player to achieve the Maria ending. It was devilishly smart of the developers to structure the game this way. Completionists and perfectionists are going to do all of these things, and thus are likely to finish the game with what some might consider to be Silent Hill 2's, quote, bad ending. At the same time, there's also some clear exploration of gender roles at this point in the game. James is placed in a position as Maria's protector, something he surely wanted to be for Mary. But you can't shoot cancer with a gun, or bash it with a 2x4, and as a result, he couldn't defend Mary from her demons the way he wished he could. But now, he can defend Maria, Mary's potential replacement, from literal monsters. Some might argue that this is an example of the chauvinist interpretation of James, but I think it works from a guilt perspective too. We, as men, don't exist in a vacuum. No matter how hard we try, the idea that we're supposed to protect our loved ones is foisted on us at a young age, through our mentors and media, and I think you could instead take this section of the game and James's role in protecting Maria as a reflection of the deep-seated, natural, and unavoidable masculine guilt that was always going to spawn from this tragic situation. After escaping an onslaught of monsters, Maria brings James to Heaven's Night, a strip club. We see more of that hesitancy here. When she takes the stage to dance with the stripper pole, James almost seems disgusted by her. It might just be the fact that he wants to go back into the town and look for Mary, which he does voice, but it's hard for me to ignore that at this stage, anyway, James seems so uncomfortable around her. As I discussed in Maria's video from back in June, she pulls out all the stops in this scene in an effort to tempt him. When she fails her seduction check, she tries to make him feel bad for her, and then even breaks out a bottle of whiskey. James noticeably struggles to turn down the drink, as shown in this shot here. Unless I missed something, this is the only part of the remake where the subject of alcohol is addressed. In the original game, James had a few lines of internal monologue about alcohol, in which he said that drinking is a way to get away from the loneliness and the pain, but that in the end, it doesn't change anything. Given that this internal monologue is easy to miss, while James is shaking hands in this cutscene are front and center, but still the sole reference to alcohol in a 20-hour game, I'd say that the two references are roughly equivalent. It's brief, but drawing more attention to it would have made it far less subtle than the internal monologue from the original. James's history with alcohol is certainly an interesting topic to explore as we seek to understand his character. Again, he really wants to take that drink, but I personally have a hard time believing he is or was an alcoholic. If he were, I think it'd be a much larger theme than it is. We'd probably see monsters with undeniable allusions to alcohol, like we do with all the sexual imagery, and he probably wouldn't have been able to turn down the drink. That said, I do think it's pretty clear, especially if you consider this scene as a callback to the internal monologue from the original, that James turned to alcohol to cope with the pain and loneliness while Mary was sick. To me, this isn't much of a surprise, and while I do think there are many instances where calling out James for his actions is entirely justified, I struggle to do so here. Alcohol is a common vice for many adults, especially those who are dealing with deeply traumatic situations, like the one James was in while Mary was sick. Generally, in my analysis, I put the focus in that situation on Mary. She was the one who was terminally ill, and I think the evidence plainly shows that James didn't do the best job of supporting her, of living up to the promise of in sickness and in health. But in fairness to him, it's worth remembering that Mary's declining health and deterioration had an impact on him too. A person's terminal illness doesn't just affect them alone. Everyone in their inner circle, from friends to family, is damaged by it as well. And if, after Mary left for the hospital, James turned to alcohol to deal with the pain, I have a tough time judging him for that, so long as that's all it was. Once more, there's no indication that it was anything more than a coping mechanism. An unhealthy one, yes, but we have no evidence that it escalated to anything beyond that. No proof that he was an alcoholic, or that he spent his time drinking instead of visiting Mary. If there were signs of such things, I'd feel differently. But this singular moment, in which James turns down a drink after being tempted in multiple other ways, is all we have to go off of. Therefore, I'm inclined to say that it was a vice he turned to in troubled times, nothing more. That having been said, alcohol and alcoholism, like so many of the topics we've discussed so far, and like so many more we've yet to dive into, is a charged topic. And thus, just like the subjects of sexuality and end-of-life care, your funds of knowledge are going to come into play here. So if you're a person who has a history with alcoholism, or a person who watched someone you know struggle with alcoholism, then it's entirely possible that you're going to come away with a different interpretation of James and his relationship with alcohol. The same is true when you consider the existence of Heaven's Night itself. If most of what James encounters in Silent Hill is a manifestation created by the town, or crafted by his subconscious, then it's either another sign of his sexual frustration, or something more. From the sexual frustration angle, you can very easily work in each of the interpretations of that particular theme that we discussed earlier. It could simply be an indication that he's horny. It could be a reminder of just how big of an issue the lack of intimacy was for him, to the point where it became truly problematic. Or it might be another example of the shameful and anxious portrayal of sexuality. I'd argue that this point of view works well with James's hesitancy towards Maria in this scene. When you look at it from this angle, it's almost as if Maria dancing with the stripper pole is both a tempt and a taunt all at the same time. As in, it's the town's way, or James's subconscious way, of saying to him, "You were sexually frustrated. Isn't this what you wanted?" This is furthered when you consider the taboo nature of strip clubs in general. But you can certainly take all this in a different direction entirely and argue that James took steps to, for lack of a better term, alleviate his sexual frustration, and thus visited strip clubs while Mary was sick. This could be the reason for his presence here in Silent Hill, and why Maria brings him here in the first place. Silent Hill 2 is all about James, slowly but surely, facing the truth about what he did, and the presence of Heaven's Night, at this point in the story, might be a subtle way of telling us that this is a place he went to in order to deal with the lack of intimacy. If this is true, then it's up to you whether or not that's considered cheating. There is far from a cultural consensus on the matter, and opinions differ from person to person, and relationship to relationship. If that's your take on Heaven's Night, then I definitely argue that this viewpoint, at the very least, makes James look pretty terrible, and that he was spending money on strippers while his wife was dying in the hospital. But cheating? That's a question that can only be answered through your funds of knowledge. As for my take on Heaven's Night, I personally don't believe that James visited strip clubs while Mary was sick. There's a certain level of caution and apprehension here that I don't think we'd see from James if he was a regular customer at a strip club. He seems very out of his element. He doesn't seem to be very familiar with this type of establishment. In fact, I'd go so far as to say he seems repulsed by Heaven's Night, which I really do think supports the shame and anxiety take on the theme of his sexual frustration. After leaving Heaven's Night, Maria will take James to Moonlight Grove, where she'll tell him a story that's intended to parallel his own search for Mary. At the end of her tale, they'll hear a scream from the movie theater, which James will sneak into in search of Laura. When you consider the roles of these two characters, Maria as a force that tries to tempt James to give in to his selfish side and distract him from finding Mary, and Laura is a symbol of youthful innocence who knew Mary very well before her death, and, just like James, has come to Silent Hill looking for her, you can almost look at them as opposing forces in James's journey. Maria pulls James towards denial, towards replacement, and the darkest interpretation of his actions, while Laura draws James towards the truth, towards facing the reality of what he did and accepting its consequences, so much so that when the truth does come out, she'll be among those to punish him for it. This idea of them as opposites deepens when you consider that there are only two endings in which we see James depart from Silent Hill, and in one, he's with Laura, and in the other, he's with Maria. As we'll discuss later, there's a wide gap between these two conclusions, as one presents James with a potential path forward, while the other suggests that he'll soon end up here again. Thus, one of the questions that begins to arise at this point in the game is which character is your James going to gravitate to? The little girl who remembers who Mary really was and can help him come to terms with his sin? Or the chauvinist fantasy version of his dead wife, who will keep him in a state of denial? While searching the theater, James will run into Eddie for a second time. Focusing on our protagonist, this scene, in my view, serves as a reminder of his limited empathy. When James proposes that they work together to find Laura, Eddie gets offended, because it wasn't that long ago that James turned down his offer to team up. There was a clear reason for this. James has a greater purpose in Silent Hill, whereas Eddie just wants to find his way out of the town, and therefore they were, essentially, two ships passing by each other at that point in the game. But Eddie, no doubt due to his own history of feeling like an outcast and being rejected and bullied, took it as a slight, and thus, when the matter comes up again, with James on the other side of it, he takes offense. The reaction confuses James, which is fair. Eddie does come off as rather hostile here, but someone with a greater well of empathy would recognize that Eddie has some significant trauma that's impacting his behavior, and that what James did earlier, even if no offense was intended, triggered something for this tormented young man. But even in the most generous interpretation of James's character, he's too surly for that sort of thing. In search of Laura, James and Mary find their way to Brook Haven Hospital. It's one of the game's key locations, with importance that grows as the game goes on. Surely James spent much of his time, or perhaps should have spent more of his time, depending on your point of view, in places like this while Mary was ill. And appropriately, it's here that James encounters another type of monster, the bubblehead nurses. There's some obvious provocativeness to the design, note the low-cut shirt, so I do think you could throw this into the sexuality discussion we've been having throughout this video. The common interpretation, following this line of thinking, is that James was eyeing up nurses at the hospital when he came to visit Mary. Just as before, you can examine this through the same three lenses we've been using all along. It could be an illustration that James is a chauvinist, who spent his time lamenting his lack of sex, oogling nurses, and visiting strip clubs when he should have been paying attention to his dying wife. Or it could be a sign that due to his sexual frustration, his eyes wandered, but still, he feels guilty about it, to the point that representations of the nurses he used to look at are now attacking him at the hospital. But if we again turn to the words of Masahiro Ito, it's possible to interpret the bubblehead nurses from an entirely different perspective. According to him, the nurses' bubble heads represent Mary's own head, swollen by her disease, and the way she looked after James suffocated her. The way they rapidly shake their heads, too, is a reference to suffocation, to how Mary shook her own head as he smothered her with a pillow. So, from a more straightforward, author-centric point of view, this monster is about continuing to remind James of the sin he committed just 3 days ago, a theme that carries on throughout the hospital. However, I think the most interesting part of the bubblehead nurse's design is Ito's claim that part of her face is supposed to look like a baby's, and that this detail was included as a reference to James and Mary's desire to have a child. It's intriguing to me that he describes it as James and Mary's desire to have a child, as in, it wasn't just something Mary alone wanted, but a dream they shared as a married couple. It's not entirely a surprise. Mary was very close with Laura, and James can leave town with the little girl at the end of the game. But I really think this piece of information speaks to the overall tragedy of Silent Hill 2's story. Sometimes we spend so much time examining the ways James could have been a better husband, or simply more supportive of Mary, that we forget that at one point, they were a loving couple with hopes, dreams, and aspirations, just like any other. But the illness that forced Mary to come to hospitals just like Brook Haven, brought all of that to a premature end. It's during the hospital level that the player can begin to undertake actions that will have a major impact on the ending. They've been present all along here and there, but they ratchet up noticeably in the hospital. As we'll discuss in detail at the end of the video, James is far more determined than most folks are willing to acknowledge. And in the hospital, when Maria begins to feel sick, James will have the opportunity to visit her several times, which will reward the player with additional dialogue, a cutscene, and points towards the Maria ending. That these visits function this way speaks to James's delusion. At this point, he doesn't understand what Maria is, how she's intended to distract him from his real purpose. And thus, when she falls ill, it surely leads him, and any unsuspecting player, to feel like what happened to Mary is happening all over again with Maria, and thus increases the likelihood that they are going to check in on her frequently, and deepen the possibility that they fall into the town's repetitive trap at the game's conclusion. The idea of recurring illness and repetition of Mary's fate are the key themes behind the hospital as a setting. Back in the apartments, we explored a setting connected to the early days of their marriage. Now, we're surrounded by imagery related to their most trying times together. For James to be unable to connect the dots between his return to such a place and Maria's worsening condition speaks to how deep the truth has been buried in his subconscious, or obscured by the magic of the town. While James is exploring the hospital solo, he'll eventually run into Pyramid Head for a third time. As mentioned earlier, part of Pyramid Head's role in Silent Hill 2 is to push James further along on his journey, on his road to realization. He does that here by tossing him down into a previously inaccessible part of the hospital. Out of all of James's run-ins with the Red Pyramid thing, this might be the one that, in my opinion, demonstrates that dynamic the best. As aggressive as he goes about this, it really does get him to where he needs to go. Shortly thereafter, James reunites with Laura, who reveals her history with Mary. She explains that she befriended her while she was sick in the hospital, and that this is why she said James didn't really love Mary when she met up with him outside the apartments. To a James, and by extension a player, who wants to find out the truth about what happened between him and Mary and wants James to accept and move on from it, this strengthens the idea of Laura as something of a guiding light, as the best opportunity he has for finding his way to a conclusion that puts a resolution with Mary at the forefront. But as we so often see in Silent Hill 2, there can be no catharsis for James without punishment, no acceptance without judgment, and so Laura lures James into a trap, locking him behind a set of double doors that he thought would lead to a letter from Mary. It's such an interesting sequence. Laura can't see the monsters, so she thinks she's doing nothing more than pulling a prank and locking him in a room that will take him some time and effort to escape from. In addition, the fact that James went in here looking for a letter is a hint at the MacGuffin that will take center stage at the end of the game. It was a letter that brought James to Silent Hill, and if he can get it, it will be a letter that will help him achieve the game's, quote, best ending. But because Laura can't see the monsters, she doesn't realize the profound danger she just put James in. As she runs away, he's attacked by the Flesh Lips, Silent Hill 2's second boss. It bears a striking resemblance to the game's final boss, her, and according to Ito, these similarities are intentional. Whereas her is very clearly a representation of dying Mary bound to her hospital bed, the Flesh Lips is more of an abstraction. It looks like her, but all of the details are obscured because James is yet to remember what he did. Taking a closer look at its appearance, it's almost as if the person at the center of the creature is obscured by a sheet, reminiscent of Mary's bed sheets, which James wrapped her up in before putting her in the back seat of his car. The cage, meanwhile, calls to mind the execution cages James saw in the portrait of Pyramid Head from the Silent Hill Historical Society. But as noted by Ito, he turned them upside down to demonstrate that Mary is not someone who's being punished, but rather a victim. As for the mouth, the proverbial flesh lips, Ito says that they represent the abusive way that Mary spoke to James in the late stages of her sickness. We see this in the long hallway scene, which we'll examine in detail towards the end, but the fact that this symbol pops up as early as this boss fight seems to indicate that Mary's treatment of James during her illness was far more aggressive than I had previously realized, and evidence that the long hallway scene wasn't just some one-off incident, a moment of weakness on Mary's part, but rather a piece of a pattern that played a significant role in how the story of James and Mary unfolded. From this point of view, when the Flesh Lips attack James here, it's that abusive side of Mary made manifest that's attacking him, her furious words gaining strength thanks to the magic of Silent Hill, and damaging him physically, whereas they used to damage him emotionally. At the same time, just like with the bubblehead nurses and the mannequins, you can find a sexual bent to the Flesh Lips. The lips are placed in a rather suggestive location, which one could interpret as a sign that James was so often thinking about his sexual frustration when he visited Mary, but that her abusive words were all he remembered from those interactions. Regardless of your interpretation, what I find to be most intriguing about the Flesh Lips is Ito's suggestion that it basically is her, the game's final boss, just obscured by James's delusions. It seems to suggest that if James was further along in his journey at this point, then it might have had the potential to be her, and to bring James to the same realization he comes to in the finale. And thus, the fact that the team of Pyramid Head and Lara bring James to it demonstrates the themes of both of these characters on James's Odyssey, how they simultaneously push James towards the truth and punish him at the same time. But the hospital's most important scene, as far as our understanding of James is concerned, takes place at the end of the Otherworld section. After reuniting with Maria, Pyramid Head arrives and kills Maria by stabbing her through the chest just as James reaches the elevator. It's an obvious reference to what James did just 3 days ago, and though he doesn't realize it yet, you can see in his expression that he's not just heartbroken to be alone again, without the woman who so resembles his dead wife. He's beginning to see the truth, that all of this is happening to him for a reason, and that there are far darker sins in his past than he yet realizes. After Maria's death, her first one, that is, James leaves Brook Haven Hospital and enters a rainy, waterlogged fog world that is far more dangerous than it was when he was last here. It won't be long before he comes upon Angela in Rosewater Park, in a meeting that Bloober Team added to the game. Though it's a small addition, one that I broke down in detail from Angela's perspective in my video on her, what stands out, to me, from James's side of things, is how it highlights the remake's slightly softer portrayal of his character. In the remake, James is still surly, but we see signs of that potential for kindness that Mary writes about in her letter to Lara later in the game. There's strong evidence of that here. James seems genuinely happy to see Angela alive. I think he does want to team up with her to navigate the trials and tribulations of the dangerous resort town. But still, there's a clear limit to the kindness he's capable of showing. He's not happy to see her personally, he's happy to see her alive and well. And he still struggles to grasp the trauma she's dealing with, even on a basic level. Though some might argue that this softer portrayal of James is antithetical to the story of Silent Hill 2, I disagree for several reasons. First, I'd factor it in as a different interpretation of the story. They took the canvas that was there, with lines drawn in, and added their own colors, so to speak. It also aligns with the more realistic vibe of the remake. The dreamlike and surrealist qualities of the original were fantastic at the time, but would have run the risk of seeming out of place in a modern setting. And furthermore, if you've been following my analysis of the monsters we've discussed so far, and paying attention to the symbolism Ito intended for each of them, it's evident to me that his personal interpretation of James is likely on the softer side. To be clear, I'm not saying that he finds him to be redeemable or anything like that. I don't want to put words in Ito's mouth, but it sure seems, to me anyway, that he has a more charitable view of James's character than some fans do. Given that Ito was involved in the remake, I'm inclined to think that he gave this slightly softer portrayal of James his blessing. But my personal belief on why James is portrayed in a slightly softer light in the remake circles back to the loop theory. For the uninitiated, the loop theory is a long-held fan theory that James is in a recurring cycle, and that he's doomed to repeat the events of the game, from his arrival in Silent Hill, to his partnership with Maria, and finally his battle with her, over and over again until he reaches a state of inner peace and acceptance, as represented by the Leave ending. All the other endings, according to this theory, are just steps along the path, and return James to the beginning of his journey. It's not a perfect theory, there are some significant issues with it, but evidence can be found in the fact that all the bodies you can find in-game, from the ones Eddie kills to the infamous man staring at the TV screen in the apartment building, do look like James, as well as the Rebirth and Maria endings, which fit neatly with this line of speculation. But for our purposes, what I think makes the loop theory the greatest reason for James's softer portrayal is that Bloober Team really leaned into it in the remake. The dead bodies I mentioned earlier are more visibly James's, and the photographs you can find throughout the game are blatant references to it. Therefore, I propose that Bloober Team's way of looking at the remake is that it's just another step along the path in the loop theory, and that at this point in the cycle, their version of James is a bit closer to achieving inner peace than the James of the original game. I like this because it aligns with my own feelings about the Leave ending being more believable in the remake. It strengthens my opinion that the remake, as good as it is, should be viewed as a work that exists alongside the original, and not a replacement for it, nor a detriment to it. But no matter how you choose to look at it, we really do see proof of that slightly softer side here. Though, unfortunately for James, it does little to help Angela. Following the short-lived reunion with Angela, James returns to the Silent Hill Historical Society, where two pieces of information help put the game's narrative into context. The first is the image of the town's executioners, which obviously inspired Pyramid Head. It's so fitting that this is how his subconscious, or the town itself, manifested James's desire for punishment. No doubt, him and Mary visited this place during their trip to Silent Hill, and the image stuck with him. So much so that when the time came to push him towards the truth of what he did, it created a horrifying creature based on this terrifying historical detail. The second relates to Mary's illness, as it's here that we learn that Brook Haven Hospital was originally established for the victims of an obscure plague that rocked the region. As I mentioned earlier, I suspect that this obscure plague is what claimed Mary's life. It would add to the tragedy of the narrative. The dark history of the town they loved, that they visited on a perfect vacation, is what brought about her death. It also adds a layer of dramatic stress to the story that benefits some interpretations of James. This wasn't a common condition Mary was stricken with. It was something rare and unfathomable that unraveled their life and their marriage. Previously, I'd always thought that Mary was suffering from some form of cancer, which I believed made the story more relatable. And though I do think that its general relatability is part of what makes Silent Hill 2's narrative so good, and something the developers wanted players to feel, the more I read Ito's comments on the game, the more I'm inclined to think that the uniqueness of James' situation is something that is meant to stand out here. In other words, I think their goal was to present Mary's illness as relatable from a distance, with surface elements many of us can connect with. But the deeper you go into the fog of the situation, I think they wanted the audience to be shocked by the specifics of it, and how intense things were for him and Mary. And a unique, rarely seen plague would certainly help with this portrayal. For James, the visit to the Historical Society commences a trip to the deepest aspects of his psyche. We've now learned the origins of much of what he's been dealing with, the Pyramid Head and Mary's illness, but now the time has come for a downward spiral that will lay bare the frayed ends of his mind. From the Historical Society, we reach Toluca Prison, an obvious symbol of guilt. Again, the player still doesn't know what James did at this point, but between what happened with Pyramid Head at the end of the hospital and the prison, the game is telling us that James needs to be punished, and that we should be suspicious of what he said so far about Mary and the circumstances around her death. Digging deeper into James's guilt for a moment, it's yet another aspect of his character that exists downstream of the game's endings. Is he guilty because he's a decent man, who knows that he did something terrible in the name of mercy? Or is he guilty because he did indeed kill Mary for selfish reasons? Both are possible, depending on your point of view. Interestingly enough, Masahiro Ito believes that in the aftermath of the Leave ending, James would have turned himself into the police, which, I suppose, turns the prison into not only a symbol of guilt, but some potential foreshadowing for that version of James. One of the prison's best known segments is the Hangman Puzzle, or the Gallows Puzzle as some call it. Here, the player is tasked with piecing together 6 poems. 5 tell the stories of guilty people, but 1 is about someone who acted in self-defense, and thus is innocent. To progress, James will need to select the noose that corresponds to the innocent person. It's a tremendously strong piece of classic Silent Hill puzzle-oriented gameplay, but just as importantly, as far as our understanding of James's character is concerned, it helps an astute player to begin to think more deeply about our protagonist's crime. All of these stories can be seen as allusions to James's own, just like the coin puzzle and Maria's story at Moonlight Grove, and thus, a player who's figured out what's going on, or is here on their second run, can further engage with the question of whether or not James acted out of mercy, selfishness, or something in between, what consequences he ultimately deserves for his darkest deed. During his trek through the prison, James will again cross paths with Eddie. This time, Eddie has gone from a paranoid loner to an unhinged man on the edge. The Eddie from the apartment and the movie theater was afraid, hiding and looking for validation, while this one has fully embraced his darkest inhibitions. I'll admit here that I was too harsh on Eddie in my video on him, and that I intend to correct that down the line. But I still believe that the Eddie of this scene, and the next one, are both terrifying monsters who are finding joy in violence that you just don't see from the other characters. To me, that's what this interaction with Eddie is intended to illustrate. It's intended to mirror the vile person James himself can embrace in some of the game's endings. Though the prison has many harrowing levels, its bleakest can be found at the end, when James crosses over into Angela's Otherworld and battles the Abstract Daddy, a dark reflection of her father who abused and tormented her throughout her life. To properly understand this scene, it's important to remember that for James, the Abstract Daddy remains an abstraction. Much like with the Flesh Lips, James can't see the full picture of what it represents because he isn't Angela. He's merely a visitor in her otherworld. Whatever the Abstract Daddy truly looks like to her is far more disturbing than this. Still, that he fights back against it and essentially does save her from something she was unable to defeat herself is, I'd argue, an objective act of good, and maybe the best thing James does throughout the game, depending on your viewpoint, given that it's something every version of him does, regardless of the ending. But even in an expression of human decency, we see the limit to James's kindness once more, as Angela provokes him into yelling at her at the end of their conversation following the boss battle. Though he was provoked, it's far from what she needs right now, not after admitting to what her father did to her while she was growing up. Critically, what provokes James here is what Angela says about Mary. She accuses him of not wanting her around anymore, of finding someone else. All of this is true to some extent, but just how true it is depends on your preferred ending, and you can see how much James struggles with this thought in the brilliant motion capture acting. As she leaves, he mumbles to himself that he would never something. He never finishes the thought, But this amounts to the beginning of a series of developments that push him closer and closer to the truth of what happened. After traversing the prison and its themes of guilt, we come to the labyrinth, a literal embodiment of James's subconscious. As James navigates it, he routinely returns to a cell-like area where he finds Maria, trapped behind iron bars. Given that she is, on some level, a manifestation, as we explore the depths of James's subconscious, so too are we exploring Maria and her purpose in his journey. As I broke down in my Maria video from a few months back, her words here are all about taunting James, and alluding to the role she can potentially serve if he embraces her namesake ending. At the same time, her status, separated from him in a room that calls to mind Mary's own at the end of her life, gives him a goal to focus on as he explores the twisting labyrinth. Crucially, it's here that she mentions the videotape that will, later on, bring about the game's most startling revelation. Symbolically, that Maria is trapped behind iron bars in a region of the game that represents James's mind is rather intriguing, and it works on multiple levels. It suggests that during Mary's illness, James felt as though his late wife was locked away from him, in a situation where he couldn't help her. Though this is no doubt true, as I said earlier, you can't shoot an illness with a gun, it does dovetail very well with the topic of James's hero complex and feelings of masculine impotence, which we discussed earlier during the stretch of the game when he was protecting Maria from monsters. At the same time, given what happens at the end of the labyrinth, it also suggests that the truth about both Maria and Mary is locked in the deepest confines of James's mind, and can't be accessed until he's explored the rest of his subconscious, as represented by the rotten, ruined, and desolate areas. This take works well with the idea that James's subconscious created everything we've seen so far in the game, and honestly, it might be one of the strongest points in its favor. After completing the labyrinth, James returns to Maria's cell, where, to his horror, he finds her dead. Though the player is no doubt beginning to question who James really is at this point, this appears to be the second time now that our protagonist has been forced to see this stand-in for his wife dead, a callback to how Mary probably looked in her final moments in her hospital bed. Coupled with Angela's words, it helps clue us into the reality that James played a part in Mary's death, and that he's not just an innocent caretaker. And what happens next with Eddie, of course, will be the strongest hint before the truth comes out. But before we get there, there's another scene worth talking about. This brilliant moment, added in the remake, where James drags Pyramid Head's knife with him to slice through the arms that have long been preventing his exit from the labyrinth. My understanding is that this is a moment that Team Silent wanted to put in the original game, but couldn't pull off due to the limited technology of the 2000s. So it's really cool to see it fully realized here in a modern day video game. But from a character perspective, this is all about drawing a parallel between James and Pyramid Head. When last we saw him, he killed Maria, and though we're left to assume it was sickness this time, the memory of what Pyramid Head did to her persists. And by allowing him to use the Great Knife, the developers are hinting that there's a deeper link between James and his tormentor that we should be looking out for. As for the arms, they represent the last vestiges of the town's monsters attempting to keep James from the truth. Once they've been cleared away, there's little standing between James and the realization of what he did. And though Pyramid Head isn't here himself to usher James forward, his trademark weapon is. At the end of the labyrinth, James will find Eddie in a state of rage as he fires his gun into a corpse. As I alluded to earlier, I do believe that he was pushed to this point. I suspect that in Eddie's Otherworld, leering eyes and jeering faces are around every corner, repeating the words of those who bullied him throughout his life. And now, driven mad by his paranoia and their harmful words, he's become a monster who thinks that might makes right and finds joy in violence. Provoked again, much like he was by Angela, James ends up punching Eddie, triggering a confrontation in which he continues to glorify the things he did before he came to Silent Hill, such as shooting his bully in the leg and killing his dog. On one hand, it is a reflection of the kind of man James can become, but more importantly, as far as James's immediate journey is concerned, it's about showing us that killing other humans is something our protagonist is more familiar with than we realize. James has, by this point, killed countless monsters, but when he defeats Eddie, it's the first human he's killed since he arrived in Silent Hill. As Eddie dies, James reacts the same way he did back in the bathroom at the beginning of the game. This is our strongest hint yet that James's subconscious, or the town of Silent Hill, has been hiding something from us. This is a trauma response, a realization that he's just done something with those hands that can't be taken back. And just as earlier, it's a classic sign of guilt. Now, at last, we have enough familiarity to begin to put the pieces together, to guess at James's larger role in Mary's death, and what must have happened moments before the game began. At the same time, I do think it's important to note that James was pushed into killing Eddie. He didn't come down here seeking violence. He attacked him after he pointed a gun in his face. It was something he felt he had no choice but to do. Acts of violence don't necessarily appear to be natural to him, They seem to be something he only does when he feels backed into a corner, as he was here. Whether or not this logic can be extrapolated to James's other sin, however, is up to you. As in, it may be that Mary's murder, like fighting Eddie, is something he did because he felt it was the only option he had available to him. He couldn't purge a disease from her by bashing it with a pipe or shooting it with a shotgun, but he could, as she slept soundly during her final trip home from the hospital, end her suffering. This interpretation works well with the Leave ending, where Mary herself argues that James killed her for this very reason. Of course, this cuts the other way as well. You could just as easily make the argument that James felt backed into a corner because he'd grown tired of caring for her, wanted to move on with his life, and been left broken by her abusive words when he came to visit her. This is supported by the symbolism of the mouse on the fleshed lips, and it's an outlook that James essentially admits to in the Maria ending. Before we continue, I do have to say that it's fitting that James experiences his trauma response at the end of the labyrinth. If the labyrinth level is best understood as an exploration of James's mind, then of course it would be here, after seeing Maria dead in her hospital bed and a boss battle with Eddie, that James would have a moment of clarity that helps us understand the truth of what he did. Mary's murder is the thing his subconscious, or the town of Silent Hill, buried deepest inside his mind. It's only natural that our journey through the labyrinth would end with our greatest hint at James's darkest deed. Fittingly, it's at this point that the text of Mary's letter vanishes entirely, indicating to us that it was fake all along. No doubt, it was killing Eddie that caused this to happen, as a second murder shattered the delusion or the magic of Silent Hill, whichever force has been behind James's journey. If you're on the delusional side of the debate, then it's because we fully explored James's mind in our trek through the labyrinth, and now that he's committed yet another act of violence against another human being, he's beginning to recall the truth of what he did. The barriers his amnesia constructed are coming down. If you're on the Silent Hill magic end of things, then it's because James is now so close to Lakeview Hotel and the most important revelation of his adventure that the town has decided to stop pulling its punches and start forcing James to confront reality. Regardless of your opinion, the vanishing text of the letter is one of those small details about Silent Hill 2 that makes the game so damn powerful. It's significant to our understanding of James's character, it helps push both him and us forward on his Silent Hill journey. And thus, in search of answers, James rows across Toluca Lake, hoping that Mary is waiting for him out there in the fog. After rowing for some time, James reaches Lakeview Hotel. It's been a long and arduous journey, but he's at last found his way to the special place that Mary mentioned in the now vanished text of her letter. There are two MacGuffins he's after here, a videotape they supposedly made together during their vacation here in Silent Hill, and a letter, a real letter, that Lara claims to have stolen from Mary's nurses and was intended to be given to James. What stands out to me, throughout this search for these two items, is how relatively serene the hotel is compared to other locations throughout the game. Sure, it's still dangerous, there's a Mandarin in the hotel conference room, but the vibes are so distinctly different that it's uncanny. It's as close as the remake gets to the dreamlike quality of the original. All of this is particularly interesting when you consider that according to Masahiro Ito, this version of Lakeview Hotel is actually the Otherworld version of the hotel. James won't see the real hotel until later on. That the hotel takes on this appearance for James when every other version of Otherworld he's been to is dilapidated and hostile speaks to the strength of the memories he experienced here with Mary. This was, truly, a special place for them. So much so that the town of Silent Hill, or a subconscious, has rendered it just as he remembers it from back in the day, not the burned down shell of a hotel it's been reduced to. Circling back to our earlier conversation about James's slightly softer portrayal in the remake, we see that here again in his conversation with Lara. He's certainly not warm and fuzzy, but he does joke with her about her previous treatment of him. He even displays what seems to be genuine concern when she runs off in search of the letter she thinks she lost. Though I believe James would struggle as a father, you can see the shades of a man who did, at one point, hope to be one in this conversation. In the grand scheme of things, I'd argue that this scene with Lara is the high watermark of James's softer side. He'll never appear less surly than he does here, as he and Lara share a moment together by reflecting on their respective bonds with the woman they both loved. You can see why Mary loved this side of James, and why she asked Lara to give him a chance in the strength of their interaction. The timing, of course, is unfortunately ironic, because the narrative is about to take a dramatic turn and introduce us to the darkest depths of James's personality. But there's no scene in the Otherworld version of Lakeview Hotel more important than the one that takes place in room 312, the special place within the special place that brings us to Silent Hill 2's most startling revelation. After putting the videotape into the VCR, James watches what begins as a moment from the trip he and Mary took here together, before shifting to a disturbing sight, James sneaking up on a sleeping Mary and smothering her with her pillow. Now, at long last, we know the truth. Mary didn't die of her disease 3 years ago. She died 3 days ago, and at James's hands. He's not just some sad widower who came to Silent Hill in search of his wife's ghost. He's a murderer who was drawn to the town to face the truth of what he did, to receive the punishment he believes he deserves for his crime, and to come to terms with his sin, in some way, shape, or form. James's motivations are a subject best saved for discussion around the game's 8 endings. But before we move on from the videotape, I believe it's important to examine what we see him do on it closely. First, he sneaks up on her, and when he suffocates her, she resists. These 2 details, to me, suggest that this was not something the 2 of them planned. I've had excellent conversations in the comment sections of my previous videos on Silent Hill 2 with folks who've argued that even if Mary wanted to die, it's human nature to resist, to fight for one's life. Though this is no doubt true, I have a hard time believing that this is the best explanation for what James does here. It's too neat, too clean, and removes much of the ambiguity from what he does, and the discussion around it. Second, I think it's also important to consider the timing of the murder. I've seen some folks speculate that the long hallway conversation, which we'll examine in a few minutes here, was the last conversation James and Mary had before she died. This is incorrect. The dialogue of the long hallway conversation makes it clear that this heartbreaking scene took place in the hospital, while Mary's real letter, the videotape, and the fact that James made it to Silent Hill with her body in the first place establishes, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the murder took place in their home. Thus, the long hallway conversation couldn't have been the last time they spoke before the murder, but rather a memory of what happened the last time James visited Mary in the hospital before he brought her home for what her doctors believed would be the final time. This is important because it tells us that Mary's death, from her disease, not from James, was imminent. She was going to die soon, and thus her doctors sent her home for one last time. Like everything else with James, you can look at this in multiple ways. In some respects, it supports the argument that it was a mercy killing. Her death was inevitable, and thus James decided to put a stop to her suffering, to end her pain, as Mary indicates in the Leave ending. Rather than continue to let her wither away at the hospital trapped in her cocoon of loneliness, he decided it would be best for her to die in the home they shared together. Even if it took her several more weeks or months to pass, he didn't want her to go through all the agony that was ahead of her. But taken from another angle, you could certainly reason that the timing makes James all the more selfish. That because she was going to die soon, for him to have done this in the here and now confirms that he'd gotten tired of taking care of her, that he wanted her out of the way. To make matters worse, if this is the case, then he robbed her of the last precious moment she had, as Mary says in the Maria ending. This was her final trip home. She was supposed to spend it enjoying her time with James, doing the things she loved, and seeing the rest of her friends and family. But James couldn't wait for her to die, and therefore he ended her life and took away her opportunity to enjoy the days she had left in this world. Just like so many of Silent Hill 2's story beats, we see on the videotape continues to ask our core question. What does this murder make James? Is he a cold-blooded killer who's been hiding from reality all along? Or is he a decent man who killed his wife out of mercy and is now stricken with guilt? The answer, ultimately, is up to you. But before we get into the game's branching endings and your role in determining which one is the right one, there's another round of punishment for James. First, it's at the hands of little Lara. James admits his sin to her, and she responds by pummeling him on the shoulder and running away. It's a heartbreaking moment, especially for Lara. By this point in the game, she's beginning to trust James, and now she knows him to be the monster she always feared he was, the man who she thought didn't really love Mary. It's fitting that James admitted this dark truth to her in particular, to the only person in town who knew Mary. Her friendship with Mary meant everything to her. By making this confession, he's beginning to face the consequences, to see how everyone else who loved his late wife would react to what he did. Narratively, this scene is all about James coming to terms with what he did. If he'd been alongside Eddie, Angela, or Maria when he learned the truth, they wouldn't have had the same reaction as Lara, wouldn't have been impacted to the extent she is. But in admitting it to her, this symbol of innocence, a girl who Mary pleaded with to give James a chance, he can start to accept reality, to face the consequences of his actions. Appropriately, as she pummels him, James just falls silent and takes it, much as he did when Mary yelled at him in the dialogue of the long hallway conversation. After breaking Lara's heart with his confession, James will exit the Otherworld version of Lakeview Hotel and enter the real-world version of Lakeview Hotel. As he explores this burned-out shell of a resort, he'll encounter Angela for a final time. As evidenced by the dead abstract daddies and the flames, which he says are always around her, it seems that he's once again crossed over into her Otherworld. Just as earlier, she's a few steps ahead of him on her Silent Hill journey. She's about to ascend a staircase to what I can only presume is a final confrontation with her mother, the person she was looking for, just as James will soon ascend the staircase to face off with her. If the conversation with Laura at the piano was the high point of James's softer side, this is the low end of his empathy. Angela is clearly on the brink of giving up, of taking her own life, but James can't manage to say much of anything to her. Just like after his confession to Laura, he falls silent, and in this case, fails to help a person in desperate need of help. Angela was probably too far gone at this point, but still, it speaks to the type of person James is when the pressure is on, and he needs to display some emotional awareness and empathy. Rather than speak up and reach out, he shuts down. Following his climactic meeting with Angela, James is hit with his second round of punishment, which comes at the hands of a pair of Pyramid Heads, who kill Maria for a third time. In the aftermath, James comes to terms with their role, understanding at last that their purpose was to torment him until he faced the truth. But now he's ready, and can end this at last. Personally, this has always been my favorite character moment for James, and maybe my favorite moment in all of Silent Hill 2, to be quite honest. I think there's something powerful about watching a man throw his demons off his back and face the truth. We all have our own hardships, and whether your daily battle is against depression, anxiety, or regret, I think we can all agree that it would feel great to stare down our difficulties made manifest and tell them to fuck right off. At a base level, that's what this scene is all about. And even if you're done with James at this point in the game, the symbolism of this moment is easy to get behind. Even after James's darkest deed has been revealed, rendering him unrelatable and reprehensible, there are mirrors to be found throughout his journey. And there's certainly one right here as he stares down these two Pyramid Heads. Fittingly, the boss fight with the two Pyramid Heads doesn't end with James defeating them, but rather these two manifestations of punishment committing suicide on their spears. James has proven that he indeed doesn't need them anymore, and can at last face the truth. On the way to the game's final boss fight, James enters the long hallway, where one of his last conversations with Mary will play out. As we discussed earlier, this was not the last conversation they had before she died, but rather, in all likelihood, it was simply the last conversation they had in the hospital before she returned home. It starts out fairly aggressive, with Mary lashing out at James and making a series of self-depreciating comments about her illness. As I referenced earlier, based on what Masahiro Ito said about the importance of the mouth and the fleshed lips, and how it's intended to symbolize the way Mary often spoke to James during her final months, it's now clear to me that what we hear in the long hallway wasn't just a one-time thing. This happened several times when Mary was sick, a fact that is further supported by how James doesn't say anything at all in this conversation. His lack of response makes him seem almost catatonic, resigned to his fate, as he just takes her words head on. The impact these types of moments must have had on James is deepened when you consider the way the symbol of the mouth evolves after the Flesh Lips boss fight. According to Ito, before you encounter the Flesh Lips, none of the other monsters have lips, but after killing it, all of them do. Given what we now know mouths represent in the story, it's clear to me that every monster after that boss fight is meant to allude, ever so slightly, to moments like the one we hear during the long hallway conversation. And to me, that suggests that what we hear in this conversation played a significant role in James's actions. It could be, if you're of the mindset that James wanted to be rid of Mary and prefer a darker reading of his character, that conversations like this one drove him to the brink, and that he killed her to rid himself of the need to support her through these moments. But in a more charitable reading of his character, you could make the argument that these conversations, given that they are so antithetical to the kind, caring, and loving person Mary is portrayed as in every other part of the game, are among the best evidence we have that James didn't want her to suffer anymore, to continue to go about life broken by disease, raging against her husband and the world in a way that was so out of character for her. I think even Laura would be shocked to hear this side of Mary. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a side Mary kept deliberately hidden from her as her life came to a close. Critically, no matter how you choose to interpret it, the long hallway conversation is supposed to humanize James, to show us the depths of what Mary was dealing with on the inside, and how it shattered him to the point of silence. Marriages are supposed to be about supporting one another through sickness and in health, but how many of us can listen to a conversation like this and say, with 100% certainty, that we'd be a better spouse in this moment for our own partner than James is here? It might be easy to think that we would be, but until you've been there, it's hard to say for sure if you're equipped for such a thing. And unfortunately, I think it's clear that James wasn't equipped, emotionally, for this type of situation. Circling back to what I said about him in the moments following his confession to Laura and his final meeting with Angela, once again, when presented with a moment where he needs to display empathy, James shuts down here in the long hallway conversation. You could argue, given that we know that situations like this happen frequently, that Mary's words broke James over time. But in Silent Hill 2's final hours, this is the third time when we've seen James fall silent in a moment where he needed to display emotional awareness. Therefore, I'd argue that another aspect of the long hallway conversation is about painting a complete picture of James, one that shows him as a man who folds in emotional situations. As far as his greater character is concerned, this is critical, because in one of the endings, he does show some significant growth in this regard. But regardless, with the long hallway conversation over, we at last have a complete look at all of the mandatory information Silent Hill 2 wished to impart to us about James's character. And thus, we're now forced to make a decision. Which of the game's endings is most fitting for this morally gray protagonist? Before we dive into the endings and their impact on James's character, it's important to establish two key things. First, that there really is no true canon ending to the game, and second, that James's final fate, and therefore your ultimate interpretation of him, is, to quote Watchmen, entirely in your hands. Starting with the reality that there is no canon ending, some folks cite the fact that Silent Hill 2's novelization uses the in water ending as proof that there is one. But that's a work of prose, and while there are advantages the written word has over video games, one place it certainly can't compare is in the field of audience engagement. Books can't replicate something like player-determined endings. They require a singular, more narrowly focused path, and thus we shouldn't compare what worked for the novelization to what is possible in the source material, the game. Another reason some folks argue that there is a canon ending to Silent Hill 2 is that in Silent Hill 4, The Room, the player can meet Frank Sunderland, James's father. While searching Frank's apartment, internal monologue from Henry Townshend, the game's protagonist, will reveal that he heard that Frank's son and daughter-in-law, James and Mary, disappeared in Silent Hill a few years prior. Though I'd certainly agree that In Water works very well with this piece of information, you can make the case that it works with all of the endings. As of the remake, I'd argue that it might even flow best with Bliss, where James, quite literally, appears to go missing in Silent Hill. But it still fits for the others, too. Take Leave, for example. James might depart from Silent Hill with Lara, but he's still a murderer. He can't just go back home. People would eventually find out about what he did. In that version of events, it's possible that Frank told everyone that James and Mary went missing in Silent Hill to cover for the fact that his son is hiding out on a ranch somewhere with Elvis and Jim Morrison. Again, Henry isn't a primary source on James's final fate. He's just relaying what he's heard about what happened to him from others. He didn't even hear it from Frank himself. Finally, even Masahiro Ito says that there's no true canon ending to the game. All 4, now 6, discounting the 2 joke endings, are legitimate in his eyes. He does, however, say that he prefers In Water and Leave, the latter because, in his opinion, James would end up turning himself into the police after escaping from Silent Hill. Now, moving on to the fact that James's final fate is indeed in your hands, let's take a moment to dive into the gameplay mechanics behind the endings. Taking a peek under the hood, the 3 primary endings, the ones you can get on an initial playthrough, are governed by a point system. Looking at Angela's knife, for example, will count towards In Water, while looking at Mary's picture and letter count towards Leave. As for Maria, sticking close to Maria, keeping her safe, and visiting her frequently in the hospital will help you to achieve that conclusion. It's for this reason that it's a common strategy to aim for the Maria ending, save before the boss fight with Pyramid Head and Pyramid Head, and then open it back up to look at the knife or the picture in the event that you want to trigger either of those 2 corresponding conclusions. In a similar vein, the New Game Plus endings, Stillness, Bliss, and Rebirth, all require the player to complete what essentially amounts to side quests to collect a series of items. All of this is to say that the choice really is in your hands. The developers wanted to give you the freedom to decide which ending fits your interpretation of James the best. It might not be as blatant as, say, getting a dialogue option in Red Dead Redemption 2 or The Witcher 3, but it's still player determinate, just player determinate in a more subtle 90s style. Thus, in light of this, what you, the player, need to do upon reaching the final act of the game is take a step back, think about everything you've learned, and decide for yourself, why did James kill Mary? Do you simply reach his breaking point and do something terrible as a result? Was it an act of mercy? Or is he a selfish murderer who just wanted to move on with his life? To start off our examination of the endings and their impact on James's character, let's take a look at a moment that's common to 3 of them. In Leave, In Water, and Stillness, James has a final conversation with someone who appears to be Mary at the top of a Lakeview hotel. But he quickly deduces that it's not Mary at all, but Maria disguised as Mary. In a moment of clarity that echoes what he said to the 2 Pyramid Heads, James shuts down her final attempts to tempt him and distract him from his true goal, saying that he knows now that Mary is gone. He can't just keep pretending that's not the case. In doing so, he accepts the truth. On a basic level, that these 3 endings include this scene indicates that in these endings, James has come to terms with what he did, and is ready to take his next steps forward. Though what steps these are vary dramatically across this trilogy of conclusions. Furious, Maria then turns into her, the game's final boss. In the original game, the final boss was referred to as either Maria or Mary, depending on your ending, but I very much like the ambiguity that comes with the name her. In terms of design, her is the flesh lips with all the abstracting elements removed. It's an evident representation of Mary in her hospital bed, with the bed's frame taking on the form of a cage, not unlike the cages used by the colonial age executioners of Silent Hill. Thus, when James kills her in those three endings, Leave, In Water, and Stillness, James is essentially reenacting Mary's murder by repeating what he did to her to Maria. This makes it an act of two-pronged acceptance of what he did to his late wife, and acceptance that Maria has, all along, been a force that has distracted and tempted him away from his true goal. Now, with that commonality out of the way, let's discuss how to interpret the 6 endings individually. If you believe that Mary's murder was an act of mercy, then the ending for you is Leave. In Leave, James gets a final conversation with Mary at her bedside, in which she absolves him of his guilt and hands him her real letter, the one Lara mentioned earlier. There's an overwhelming tone of affection to the entire ending. Mary holds James's hand, calls him handsome, and acknowledges that she did tell him that she wanted the pain to end. Focusing on James, although he does try to say that he killed her for selfish reasons, Mary dismisses this not just once, but twice, reasoning that if it were true, then he wouldn't look so sad in this scene. I think Mary's point is strong enough as it is. She's a good judge of character, as evidenced by her description of James in her letter to Lara, and her friendship with the little girl herself. But honestly, I'd argue that it's supported by the fact that James says this at all. There's a blend of fear and accountability in the way he says he did it because he wanted his life back. As in, he has enough self-awareness to recognize that he did have selfish thoughts throughout Mary's illness, and is scared to death that those selfish thoughts motivated him to kill her. And therefore, I interpret this line as not a confession, but the admission of a decent man with a guilty conscience. It's the endpoint of the shame and anxiety reading of James's character. He killed his wife because he loved her, and he didn't want her to suffer anymore. But he's so damn overwhelmed by the gravity of what he did, and afraid of his surly side that his subconscious, or the town of Silent Hill, created Pyramid Head to give him the punishment he felt he deserved. Furthermore, this line is also a display of empathy, something he was unable to do after his confession to Lara, in his final conversation with Angela, and in the long hallway scene. After all this time, he's finally showing some emotional intelligence by admitting to his faults. That's growth. It took us a long time to get here, but after a 20-hour journey, in just one of the endings, we get some real empathy from James. Critically, this ending sees James make amends with Lara. Though some might argue that this detail makes it seem overly hopeful, I'd say, instead, that the fact that Lara seems to be on good terms with James, to the point where she's playing around behind him as they leave the town, indicates that after reading Mary's letter, which James does give to her, that even she knows that in this version of events, the woman she befriended in the hospital was indeed ready for the pain to end. This conclusion just doesn't work any other way. If Lara doesn't accept it as the truth, then it doesn't make much sense. For James moving forward, this ending does provide him with the opportunity to start down the road to redemption. Maybe he drives Lara back to the orphanage, maybe he adopts a new identity and raises Lara as his own, or maybe he turns himself into the police, as Ito prefers. But either way, it's the start of something new. A new path for a man who came to Silent Hill in search of punishment, but ultimately found a way to forgive himself for a sin he committed in the name of love and mercy. Now, if you still believe that James murdered Mary out of mercy, but either doesn't deserve absolution or wouldn't be able to forgive himself, then the best ending for you is In Water, where James takes his own life by driving his car into Toluca Lake. The mercy concepts are highlighted by Mary's letter, which features the same text as the letter from Leave, and the confirmation that Mary's body is in the backseat of James's car. According to Ito, the fact that the body is in the back seat and not in the trunk is deliberate. It suggests that James truly loved Mary, that he continues to treat her body with respect despite what he did to her. As for the lack of absolution, by James taking his own life, James is delivering a final punishment to himself by acknowledging that what he did was wrong, and ending it all in the depths of the lake. While it's not my personal favorite conclusion, at least not in the here and now, I think the strongest thing about the In Water ending is that it does an effective job of honoring the ambiguity of James's character. What James deserves after what he did is a complicated question. Even if you're solidly in one camp or another, you'd be forgiven for changing your mind depending on the day. There's no easy answers here. In Water, I'd argue, honors all sides of the argument in that it provides room for the idea that James both loved Mary and did something entirely unforgivable all at the same time. On the other hand, if you're of the opinion that Mary's murder was a selfish act committed by a selfish man who wanted to move on with his life, then the ending you're looking for is Maria. Notably, in this ending, James admits to Mary that he killed her for selfish reasons. But unlike in Leave, here, Mary doesn't dismiss his words. She knows they're true, likely because she's watched James cling to Maria throughout his trek through the fog. His behavior has informed her opinion of her own murder, made it clear that it wasn't an act of mercy, and that the sweet man she loved beneath the surly veneer is gone. The surly veneer is all there is. Digging deeper into James's words here, it really is so much different than what he says in Leave. As mentioned in Leave, there's fear and accountability in his words. He looks Mary right in the eye when he speaks to her. In Maria, he sounds embarrassed and looks away. There's no honesty, no decency, just pathetic excuses for his selfish and vile deeds. And if this is your reading of James, then I'd say that Maria is a relatively satisfying conclusion. Not only does Mary get to call him out on his bullshit, but James outs himself as a complete asshole when he cold-heartedly tells Maria that she'd better do something about her cough as they're leaving Silent Hill. More than any other ending, this James demonstrates that he's just as awful as some people believe him to be. He is who Laura thought he was, who players who prefer this ending thought he was, and he deserves to start this cycle all over again, as implied by Maria's illness. In the Maria ending, even the battle with her takes on a different context. Here, it's Mary, not Maria, who transforms into this horrifying final boss. Thus, in killing her in this version of events, James is essentially repeating his murder of Mary, and demonstrating, symbolically, that he'd do it all over again if he were placed in the same position. This, in my view, truly makes the James and the Maria ending one of the most monstrous characters in the entire franchise, more vile than any of the creatures that stalk the fog of the haunted resort town. Moving on to the New Game Plus endings, if you're partial to a reading of James that focuses on his delusion and selfishness at the same time, then Rebirth is the right path for you. Here, James, in a distant, aloof, and disaffected tone that reminds me so much of the original game's portrayal, states his intention to try and revive Mary through the magic of the old gods of Silent Hill. He sounds legitimately crazy here, and if you believe that his subconscious, and not the town itself, is behind what's been going on with him, then this is probably the conclusion you prefer. Although, as I've said before, I'm partial to the idea that it is indeed Silent Hill's nature that has brought James to this point, I do like that the game features a delusional conclusion to his character arc, because it remains a valid interpretation in my view. As for how the boss fight with her can be interpreted here, I'd say that by killing the final boss, James is removing the delusion of Maria so he can instead follow through on his delusional plan to revive Mary. Now, let's talk about Stillness, which is far more popular than I ever thought a Bloober Team original ending would be. Stillness draws a middle ground between Leave and In Water. It's for those of you who find Leave to be too positive and In Water to be too bleak. Expanding on that, I'd say that for those of you who feel that James deserves to move on with his life, but shouldn't get a shot at redemption, this is likely a conclusion you'll prefer. Here, James gets a brief final conversation with Mary, in which she promises to wait for him, and though he does drive his car into the Toluca, he jumps out before it hits the water, allowing him to live on while Mary's body sinks to the bottom of the lake that got her sick in the first place. Finally, Bliss is for those of you who favor a delusional interpretation of James, but remain sympathetic to him. He fails to face reality, much like with Rebirth, but it doesn't seem to harm anyone. He just persists in a fantasy, a daydream where Mary never got sick and they can continue to live their life together. So those are the 6 endings, and how they all exist downstream of your interpretation of James. As we've explored James's character for almost 2 hours now, my goal has been to try and honor each of these interpretations as fairly and as evenly as possible, to allude to each one when the evidence that supports them arises, provide counterpoints when necessary, and filter in the intentions of the developers here and there, to provide you with enough information about all the sides of James's character and combine it with your funds of knowledge so you can make a final decision about what ending makes the most sense to you, and interpret the overall narrative of Silent Hill 2 accordingly. And thus I invite you, down in the comments, to tell me exactly that, to explain which ending makes the most sense to you given what we know for certain about James's character and all the potential interpretations of him. But although Silent Hill 2 is an intentionally ambiguous game, you didn't come here for ambiguity from me, not here at the end. So which ending do I believe best suits James's character? Well, over time, my opinion on the matter has evolved substantially. Back in the day, with the original Silent Hill 2, I preferred the In Water ending, as James's aloof and distant personality led me to believe that his actions were firmly in the middle of the mercy to selfish murder scale. But the softer portrayal of James here in the remake has turned me into a fan of Leave. James's personality is only slightly softer, but it's enough to convince me that he isn't a monster, but rather a complicated but decent man who did a monstrous thing because he didn't want his wife to suffer anymore. I find James's fearful admissions and Mary's multiple dismissals to be critical in this regard. He tries to shoulder the blame because he knows that he should have done a better job of supporting her, but Mary shuts it down because she knows her husband better than that. But ultimately, what's really pushed me over the edge into this territory is the many citations I made throughout this video to Masahiro Ito. After reading his commentary, it's evident to me that the developers saw James as a morally gray person who was pushed into doing a terrible thing due to a combination of stress and a desire to take his wife's pain away, to help her escape from the person the disease turned her into the only way he could. The symbolism of the mouths, the Pyramid Head himself, and Ito's take on the closet scene all speak to this. And thus, for that James, for a James that was motivated by mercy, leave is what he deserves. It's what Mary wanted, for him to depart from Silent Hill and move on. And he gets to do it with Lara. Think back to our conversation about the Bubblehead nurses. Ito says that part of its symbolism is that Mary and James wanted to have a child. So many of their dreams were crushed by her illness. But if James takes Lara in, the girl Mary loved like her very own daughter, then at least one of their dreams lives on. A dream that can provide James with a road to redemption, to proving that he is indeed not the monster some folks think he is, but the surly yet sweet man his wife believed him to be. But that's just my opinion, one opinion of many. Because everyone who plays Silent Hill 2 is going to come away with a different take on James's character. And that's what makes him both the greatest protagonist in all of video games, and so important to Silent Hill 2. Thanks for watching. I started this Silent Hill 2 character analysis series back in March, at a time when my channel needed some serious juice, when I couldn't rely on anything but my Night in the Woods videos to put up numbers I was happy with. Now, not only can I count on these Silent Hill videos to do well, but my other character analysis series, games like Elden Ring and Death Stranding, are bringing my channel and my work to even larger audiences. If you ask me, I have this series to thank for that, because it really helped me to get my groove back on here, and I'll always be grateful to those of you who started watching my videos because you stumbled on my coverage of Silent Hill 2. I have more videos on Silent Hill 2 on the way. I'd like to take a look at Closet Gate in detail, I'd love to take a look at what could have been done to help Eddie with the bullying he suffered from, and I think it's about time someone does a deep dive, detective style, into Mary's murder and James' motivations. So stay tuned for all that and more. Huge thanks to my Silent Hill collaborators, Matthias T. Taylor, David Pepiot, and Solace, for providing the music for this video. Big shout out to all my Silver and Gold tier YouTube channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Little Caesar, Reed, Pathonian, Anna Novikova, Sean Bobby, Green, and Draco Woloski, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you next time, and go birds!